Hello, and thank you for joining me today. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Holtzman, and with me is my co-host, Dr. Stephanie Weeks, on today's episode of Leadership and Lessons from the Holocaust. Our special guest today is Dr. Bill Niven, all the way from Nottingham, England, on Zoom. Bill, we appreciate you being here. Dr. Bill Niven is an Emeritus Professor of Contemporary German History at Nottingham Trent University in England. He is the author and editor of several books relating to Germany and efforts to come to terms with their National Socialist and GDR past, including facing the Nazi past and the Buchenwald child. Dr. Niven has been researching the Kindertransport with Dr. Amy Williams, and their book, Memory of the Kindertransport and Transnational Perspective, was published in 2023. And I'd like to now welcome Dr. Bill Niven. Bill, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, we met, a week or so ago in a very similar format to prepare for today. And as you know, our focus is really trying to find the connections between events in the Holocaust, reactions, and any perspectives that occurred during that time, and connecting it back to today's leadership, particularly as it relates to leadership in education, which you are very familiar with. And so today's theme, as we discussed, is the perils of indifference and the Kindertransport. And as I mentioned in my introduction, you're very well versed in that. So I was wondering if maybe you could just give us a really brief overview of your work as it relates to the Kindertransport, and your initial thoughts on how we can connect that event to helping leaders better understand their role in education.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Well, the Kindertransport is generally thought of as the rescue of about 10,000 children from Germany, largely Jewish children, to Britain. But America, of course, also rescued some children from 1934 onwards. But the Kindertransport is usually thought of as that rescue from 38 to 39. Some children also went to Sweden and Holland, Belgium, France, but most came to Britain. So it's a rescue effort, in many ways an admirable rescue effort. But you asked about indifference, and the interesting thing is, although Britain rescued some 10,000 children at that time, we didn't rescue any adults. Of course, there were some adult refugees who came into Britain, but we didn't really want to put a strain on the economy. Unemployment was high at the time. There were problems generally with inflation. So we brought in children, but we probably didn't do enough for adults. So there's already the question there, are we picking and choosing? And I think we shouldn't, if possible, pick and choose. We should try to help and support everyone. Although, of course, it's fantastic that the children were supported. The other aspect of indifference, of course, is that these children suffered a lot in Germany before they came to Britain. So the question arises as to the German neighbours. Did they think enough about their Jewish neighbours? Did they think enough about what's happening to them? Did they care? If they did, what did they do? What could they do? So I think there are questions on both sides of the channel, if you like. Did we do enough to rescue and help refugees? And did the Germans do enough to think about what was happening to the Jewish people?
You know, it's interesting. One of the things that you mentioned was the sort of the rationale for not bringing adults into Britain for the strain on the economy. And would that, in your mind, does that fall under that category of indifference? Can you make a hard decision, whether we agree with it with morality or it goes against our value system of looking back all these years later, all these decades later? Do you think that is an example of indifference? Is there a lesson in there somewhere?
It's a hard one. I think. I don't think it's indifference. I don't think that the British were indifferent to what was happening in Germany, but there was always, especially if there were politicians balancing things, how many refugees could we take in? What kind of refugees? How much were we prepared to pay? I mean, the Kindertransport, for instance, was not paid for by the British government. It was paid for largely by philanthropic organizations, Jews and Quakers amongst them mainly. So I think there was a kind of political thinking too that we didn't know how welcome Jews would be in Britain. Anti-Semitism was not known in the country. as I mentioned, giving them bringing in, grown-ups would have raised the question of having to pay for them, who was going to pay for them, were they working, if they worked, would they take jobs away? And so those kind of pragmatic considerations come into play, which makes it hard to talk about indifference. Maybe another word would be balancing the books without enough consideration for the seriousness of which the situation in which Jewish people find themselves. And I don't think that people really understood that in Britain, perhaps until Reichskristallnacht. And even after that, many didn't see the writing on the wall.
And so, so with that, when we try to bring a lesson like that, when we try to have a conversation like this with its such a historical significance, how do you see the role of today's leader in education doing exactly what you're saying, essentially not being dismissive or being indifferent about something, but making sure that the decision that you're making is balanced, to use your word? What is a lesson there for us as leaders that we should be taking away from an example like the Kindertransport?
I think the question is always how serious you perceive a danger to be that someone's facing. If you're wanting to help someone, but you realize that helping someone is going to come at a cost to the economy, a cost to, I don't know, your own personal safety, even your own personal life, your own personal conditions, how seriously do you take the threat the other person's facing? And I think you have to make that assessment. If you come to the decision that they're facing so severe a threat, a life-threatening threat, that you're really duty-bound to help them, whatever the cost to you, whatever the cost to any other considerations you might want to have, then that's a decision you have to make in favor of helping, I think. But it's always difficult to know when that moment is there. And I think in 1938, with so many Jewish people facing difficulties, I don't know if in Britain we really understood how severe those difficulties were. We do in retrospect, because we know about the Holocaust. We know what happened. We know what happened to the children, for instance, and the adults who didn't get out. In retrospect, it seems we were indifferent because we surely, had we known that, would have done more, but we didn't know it.
Right. And one last point, and I'll turn it over to Stephanie, that, having come out of one world war to potentially now engage in a second one only 20 some odd years later was probably also on the forefront of the brains of leaders and citizens of countries all around the world, including the United States.
Yes, that's definitely right. Although I think it wasn't the case that taking in German refugees was ever going to cause tensions with the Germans. The Germans were quite happy to see as many Jews go as they could get rid of. So taking them in was not a political issue in the sense of causing difficulties with Germany. It was a political issue in terms of whether governments such as the British government and also all the other governments that were involved in conversations at Evian in 1938 were simply prepared to make the effort to bring the people in. But it wasn't that it was going to cost any kind of tensions with the Germans.
Great. Thank you, Bill. Stephanie?
Well, I'm going to extend on that. I think we are seeing the true complexities of history. And we had discussed that a little bit about how historical responsibility is messy. And the complex nature of ensuring objectivity in our approach to discussing history and current events in our world today. Could you share with us some insights or guidance that you might suggest to education leaders in particular as we're considering how to address this balance and or imbalance as we look back on historical context and as we're dealing with our current events in the world?
Well, if I stick with the topic of the Kindertransport, I think we tend to think of it as a rescue effort, which it was, and we tend to focus on particular heroes who made that rescue possible. But if we're talking about objectivity and balance, we need to remember that there were actually more women involved probably in the rescue operation than were men. So we still sometimes have a rather man-focused view on history, and I think that's also true of the way we tell the story of the Kindertransport. So that's one thing I would say I want to learn. And in terms of objectivity, that we always balance rescue against what could have been done, against what wasn't done, not just against what we did. And that's not necessarily to condemn ourselves for not doing more, but it is to pose the question as to whether we could have. Because if we're to learn in any future situation, surely we'd want to look back at the Kindertransport and say, well, in those days we rescued 10,000 children and that was good, but I think we could have done more. So can we do more today than we did then? Rather than say, well, we helped then, so do we need to help now? Isn't it up to other countries to help now? Yeah, which would be a very wrong-headed kind of reaction. So objectivity for me always means measuring an event, not just in terms of its historical importance, but also in terms of what more or what else could have been done and what else and more we can learn from it for today.
And with this to kind of continue on with what Stephanie asked with regard to objectivity, when you're teaching, when you're writing, you're a published author of numerous books, and you're a professor. Objectivity for you is a critical component to informing your instruction, informing conversation. So how do you continue to grow that skill set? How do you maintain that personally? What advice do you give to your students? What advice would you give to educators, educational leaders in strategies in maintaining objectivity, even in times where it is really difficult, it is really trying, but yet you have to maintain that line. Like, as we as leaders in public education and teachers in public education have to really be very thoughtful and intentional in the way in which they deliver instruction, particularly if it's something of a controversial nature or something that is politically divisive or anything of that nature. So so your experience in the years you've been both teaching and writing, what would be some advice that you might give?
Objectivity, I think, as a historian, you have to consult as many sources as you can. Obviously, you have to consult archival sources, and I've done that throughout my life. You have to know the secondary literature. You have to know primary literature like diaries and letters and so on. And you have to be aware of different interpretations, and you have to balance them against the evidence to try to understand what you think happened. Obviously, subjectivity will always play a role, but my topic, the Kindertransport, is perhaps not so, or that particular topic that I'm dealing with is not so controversial as others. If we're thinking about the contemporary situation in the Middle East, for instance, if I may just briefly reference that, I think it's very important that we don't always believe what we read in the media, or that we look beyond the media we normally read to wider sources. So it's why I would encourage students to try to look at what is happening in Gaza from as many perspectives as they can possibly get information about, from the Israeli side, from the Palestinian side, but to make sure they're not reliant on 1, 2, or 3 sources, not reliant on hearsay. It's very, very hard at the moment, precisely because there's such pressure, I think, on people to judge the situation one or the other, that students must have the courage to say, no, I will go my own way. I will try to really find out what I think. I won't just accept this view or accept that view. And I think the teacher has to encourage them in that and not to present them with ready-made interpretations.
And so what you're referring to is something that in the States we call media literacy. And that is something that has become a relatively important concept and initiative in a lot of schools, because as you know, the younger the generation is, the more likely they are to get their news and information from social media platforms. And so the fact checking and checking the source and the checking of that source is more critical than ever. I mean, to me, your opinion is your opinion, but as long as it's informed, right? That's really what that comes down to is making sure that the information you're receiving is accurate, is timely, is checked, and then whatever perspective you have is the perspective you have.
Yeah, I don't think it's always possible to get every perspective. I just think you have to question everything. You have to question the historical sources, like archival sources. If you find one version in one source, you have to check against another source to see if it corroborates. The most important thing, I think, is simply not to accept a received idea, not to accept an idea you've not checked yourself if you can check it. You may, at the end of the day, come to the decision that you're not sure. And not being sure is also fine. You don't have to go out there and say, I think A or I think B. You can say, I think both perspectives have something for them.
Right. Or I don't know enough about it to even have a formed opinion about it.
Exactly. Don't be pressured to have an opinion. Don't, if people think you should know about that surely that's something you should or ought to be interested in. You can say, well, maybe you're right. Maybe I should pay more attention to that. But at the moment, I don't know enough. I'll try to inform myself, but not just come out with the opinion you think the other person would like to hear. It's very important to develop your own opinion.
Great. Thank you, Bill. Steph?
Based on your research, what qualities do you think distinguish educational leaders who are successfully able to cultivate a culture of courage and strength versus indifference?
That's a very, very hard question. I pondered it, what qualities they need. I mean, a teacher is talking about, say, in my case, historical material, and we'll be talking about issues of courage and issues of indifference. I think it's important when talking about these issues to make students aware that while indifference is easy, courage is hard. And so courage is not something that you can just have. And I don't think when talking about the heroes or heroines of our history, we should be making it sound as if they're special people. Either they are in some ways, but they are people because they made decisions, hard decisions, difficult decisions, but they made them. And so if you're going to be courageous, you have to be prepared to make those decisions. You have to be prepared to make sacrifices. It's not a quality that is impossible to have. Don't think it's just one or two people who have it. We all have that potential, I think. And at the same time, as far as indifference is concerned, the important thing is to spot it in yourself. And I think over the years, have a number of situations where I felt I wasn't reacting with enough sensitivity. I mean, I've just said a minute ago, if someone says to you, you should be interested in that topic, it's important to say, if you're not up to this point, maybe I'll go away and think about it. You shouldn't just have an opinion. But equally, you then should perhaps go away and think about it. Yeah. If somebody makes that charge, and try to develop an interest in whatever it is the other person thinks you should have an interest in. At the same time, you might decide it's not something at the end of the day you think is that important, but perhaps listen to what that person says.
Good.
If you think about the Kindertransport, are there individuals that exemplify both sides of that demonstration of courage, that demonstration of indifference? Are there any particular stories or narratives that come to mind?
Well, there are many stories of great courage. One involving, for instance, a Dutch helper who traveled to Vienna to meet Eichmann, Truus Weissmuller, and there persuaded him to organize the first Kindertransport out of Vienna. And that required, of course, a tremendous amount of courage to go and face Eichmann. There are other helpers who also made tremendous sacrifices in order to achieve what they achieved. And these are not people who, they obviously they don't exemplify indifference. They're the exact opposite of indifference. You can see that they're going beyond their means often in some cases, often their emotional and psychological means. You can see the strain it puts on these people, but they feel they simply have to do this and they have to help. If I sort of think about indifference, that's a harder one to measure. I think maybe the how we make a journey from indifference to that kind of commitment. And I can't think of anyone. I don't know the individual biographies of those who helped in the Kindertransport well enough to say, here's an example of someone who started out as rather indifferent, but who develops in a philanthropic direction. Yeah, I don't know any of the biographies well enough to be able to answer that question. But I wonder if you can move from that kind of indifference to courage, and if so, how that's possible.
I was actually going to ask you that, Bill. I was thinking about it. I'm like, do you think indifference is sort of a learned behavior? Like when you're young, like we always teach the kids to be bucket fillers, right? And we always talk, if you see something, say something. If you see an act of bullying, stand up to it. And so is indifference sort of learned? Is indifference sort of situational? If you feel like it doesn't necessarily connect to me or apply directly to me. And then it could be situations like the Kindertransport, where all of a sudden someone says, no, this is where I draw the line and I'm going to step in and do something. I'm wondering what your perspective is on that.
I think Indifference is, I don't think any of us like to admit that we're not interested in things. I mean, a lot of us are, there are lots of things I'm not interested in that I perhaps should have, but that's not the same as indifference. I think indifference for me is always the quality that emerges when you're faced with a situation where something might be expected of you, where you feel a kind of pressure, and I mean a good pressure, to do something, and you turn away. And it can be a tiny little thing. It can just be that you see someone being shouted at or screamed at. It can be that you see someone being racially abused verbally, and you don't intervene and you don't do anything. And I would see that as a kind of indifference, in the sense that you're saying to yourself, this hasn't to do with me. This is not my problem. But I think when those, when that happens, and when people are treated in that way, it is your problem, because you don't want it to happen to you. You don't want it to happen to anyone. There are humane standards that we must, as far as possible as individuals, observe and uphold. So I would like to hope that in a situation like that, I would say something and I would speak out. So far, it hasn't happened to me that I've faced that. But I have faced growing up with prejudice. I grew up with prejudices in my own family, and I grew up with prejudices in myself, which I knew about and observed and didn't like. And it took me a long time to overcome them. But how I overcame them was through shame. Was through learning that having the attitude I did was blocking empathy and also making me indifferent to the fate of others. I won't say any more details than that, but it was a personal experience, an individual experience I had many years ago, which helped me in this direction tremendously. I had a personal meeting with someone that made me much more aware of the need to observe one's own prejudices, because I think prejudices are very often the source of indifference. If we simply see the world a certain way, but we don't question why we see the world a certain way, and because we don't question it, we don't identify that we're being indifferent, that we're not responding with the necessary empathy.
And then that becomes the peril. That becomes the peril of indifference. That becomes like what you said. You see something that's wrong. You don't want it to happen to you. But then that directly ties back to something you mentioned earlier about being courageous. Like, in order to not be indifferent, you need to be courageous. You need to be able to say, I need to step in and do something here because what's happening is not right, even if it means I now am entangled in this web of whatever's happening, of this conflict. That I have to be okay with that, because if I were in this situation, I would want or ask for someone to intervene.
I would want other people to help me and respond in the same way, but also where you recognize it's a situation which is simply unacceptable, and you know it's unacceptable, and you know there's something you can do to show that it's unacceptable, to show perhaps to other people who happen to be there, as well as helping the person that you're trying to help. But of course, I'm aware there are differences. There are levels of this, and very often it was said of people in the Third Reich, why didn't they do more? Why didn't they protest more? Why didn't they speak out? And there can be a level at which, speaking out means risking imprisonment, for instance, in the Third Reich. And so if you recognize there are kind of barriers to speaking out, which you don't want to have to suffer, you don't want to have to face, then you will fall silent. And I think that's a very difficult. I've never been in that situation. I've never been in the situation where I lived in a dictatorship and found myself, I don't know, seeing an SS man taking a Jew away or abusing a Jew in some way. And I know perfectly well, if I complain about this, especially if I go up to him and say, don't do that, that's going to have consequences for me. And so I fall silent, and so I do nothing. How you face that kind of a dilemma and how you teach students about what to do in that situation, I find enormously hard, because to actually sacrifice your own safety, your own freedom, possibly, on behalf of another person, stepping in to support another person, it's a very heavy price to pay. Simply speaking up in the underground, if there's somebody says something nasty and say, don't say that, you shouldn't, or whatever. I mean, okay, somebody might hit you, you might get into a fight, I don't know what'll happen, but you're not facing that kind of a dilemma. So I don't think we should imagine that being courageous is an easy thing to do. I don't think it is.
Agreed.
And I feel that I've been, reflecting on this so much for a while. This fear, the prejudice is there, and the fear is there. Those are the undertowing of indifference, and I'm sure it's even more complex than that when faced with a situation and trying to make the right decision to act or not act. But I appreciate that insight about prejudice, and it elicits a sense of fear to not move forward with action. And that is a very, frightening place to be in any society where things are happening.
I think just to add, I think very often these are situations where split-second decisions have to be made. Yeah. Where you see somebody being hit or someone being maltreated in some way, and you have to respond there and then. Yeah. And how you get from, we were sitting here discussing, well, what's going through my mind? What should I do? What shouldn't I do? Am I going to end up in prison? That's probably not what happens in this situation. I think a lot of people just freeze. Yeah. I think I would probably just freeze. I don't know. And so how to help people to react swiftly in a situation like that is also something that we should maybe perhaps think about. I mean, there may be a spontaneous reaction to help, but there's also a spontaneous reaction to, as I said, to freeze.
Yes.
Bill, any final thoughts that you'd like to share before we say goodbye?
No, just thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about all this. The relationship between courage and indifference is almost one I'll have to think about in particularly what particularly interests me, though, and the question that I think you raised was how you become a rescuer. Yeah. I followed the biographies of several of the people involved in the Kindertransport, but how you actually get, a lot of them, of course, had a particular faith, or, they'd worked in philanthropic institutions, so they had a certain predisposition to help, but it's not true of all of them. And very often we all go back into their previous lives and describe what they did and where they went to school and what they studied, and then suddenly they're helping. But somehow it doesn't quite answer it, does it?
Right. Sounds like it could be the title of your new book.
Yeah, it's something for me to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. Bill, thank you so much. And thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Leadership and Lessons from the Holocaust on hmTV. I appreciate my guest, Dr. Bill Niven, for sharing some insights on the perils of indifference and the importance of courage, and his thoughts and insights on the Kindertransport. Be sure to subscribe and share and stay connected for more engaging conversations. Until next time, take care and be well.